Welcome to the second installment of the Slingshot. We've got a jam-packed show for this episode, and I'm surrounded by three regular contributors to the Sling: Darren Bush of the University of Houston, and Marshall Steinbaum and Ted Tatos of the University of Utah. Hey guys, recall on our last show, I said you can be invited to the Slingshot if you're a regular contributor or if you are an antitrust celebrity. Well, today we are joined by an antitrust superstar, Sanjukta Paul, a law professor at the University of Michigan. Welcome to the show, Sanjukta.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us on a Sunday morning. I can only imagine what celebrities like yourself must be doing on a Saturday night, staying up to all hours of the morning. So thanks so much for being here. You're probably exhausted. Now, today's topics are going to include the Microsoft Activision merger, the FTC's proposal to ban non-competes, and what The Economist dubbed Elon Musk's libertarian antics on Twitter. So beginning with the merger, the FTC is pursuing a vertical theory of harm, namely what economists call input foreclosure, which, as the name suggests, means that a vertically integrated firm withholds a key input to its downstream rivals with the aim of impairing their ability to compete effectively. Now, this legal theory didn't work out so well for the DOJ in its attempt to block AT&T's attempted acquisition of Time Warner, where CNN was the supposed must-have input that was going to be withheld from rivals. And my apologies to Anderson Cooper for that slight, but perhaps Activision's Call of Duty is more of a must-have input. What say you, Ted, to this theory of harm? Does it have legs?
Yes, I do think it has legs. So the FTC, so just to recap the FTC's argument, the FTC is essentially defining three relevant markets, one of which is high performance consoles, which does differentiate, let's say, Xbox and the PS5 versus the Nintendo Switch, and then two relevant markets that deal with content, which is the multi-game content subscription library, and then cloud gaming subscription services, the third of which is basically being able to play games that you've purchased yourself, being able to stream them online, right? So the concern that the FTC has is that essentially Microsoft is a vertically integrated entity. It owns one of the two primary consoles, right, the Xbox, and it also owns probably the number one, number two streaming service, which is Xbox Game Pass. And the concern here is that by acquiring Activision, which has some of the most popular AAA titles, so the AAA titles are the ones that are essentially the most popular and most difficult to create titles. So we're talking about, let's say, Call of Duty is number one, as you said, and there are certainly others that Sony has, and then there's a few third parties. So like Fortnite. But so the issue here is that by owning Activision, Microsoft will be able to foreclose access to its titles to third parties. And the FTC's essentially said, well, how can we tell what's going to happen? Well, one great way of telling that is, let's see what's happened in the past. So it's pointed to acquisitions like ZeniMax, where Microsoft said, look, we're going to make it available to Sony and so on, and then Microsoft then turned around and decided to cabin its access to its own services. So yes, I mean, certainly with regard to the output side, yes, I do think the FTC has one. There's also an argument for the input side, but leaving that aside, I do think, yeah, it's got to start.
Right. Well, then let's turn, now that we've hit kind of the consumer angle, why don't we turn over to some of the labor issues that got implicated by that merger? And I know that FTC Chair Lena Khan wrote an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal in the end of December titled "ESG Won't Stop the FTC," asserting that, quote, the antitrust laws don't permit us to turn a blind eye to an illegal deal just because the parties commit to some unrelated social benefit. Now, for those of you who are not woke like myself, ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance factors. And there's no mention of the Microsoft Activision merger in that piece, but one cannot help but notice that many labor activists were advocating for a settlement that would have provided a pathway to unionization for Activision workers. Now, I'll turn this one over to Marshall first. Why were some unions aggrieved about the FTC's handling of its case against the Microsoft Activision merger and this editorial in particular?
Well, I think the editorial is a little bit short-sighted about what the role of a union neutrality agreement would have been in rectifying the competitive harms from the merger. So to step back, there's an ongoing unionization campaign at Activision, as in the rest of the video game industry, among tech workers. It's a particularly exploited class where you've got sort of younger workers with less status who have a particular affinity for the job, which in many contexts means that they can be exploited by bosses and made to work many hours for low pay under poor conditions. So Activision has been fighting that unionization campaign, not surprisingly. The CWA, which is the international that's organizing, I think most if not all of the campaign, went to Microsoft and basically asked them for a neutrality agreement, which means that the employer would not avail itself of the many tactics available to employers to prevent workers from voting to join a union, including card check, meaning that there won't be an NLRB supervised election in which the locus of intimidation is concentrated, rather that Microsoft would recognize the results of a majority showing by card signing, which is typically easier to achieve a victory. Basically, the neutrality agreement says if Microsoft owns Activision, then they will be neutral in any unionization campaign at Activision. So that requires Microsoft to own Activision to begin with, i.e. the merger has to close. The CWA had made arguments against the merger from a labor perspective at first. Those arguments were not taken up by the FTC in its complaint. That is to say, there's no labor theory of harm in the complaint that was actually filed by the FTC. In the interim, this neutrality agreement was reached, which means that it's much more likely for that unionization campaign at Activision to succeed if the merger closes. Ergo, the president of the CWA advocated that the FTC should not block that merger and allow it to close, thereby triggering the neutrality agreement and potentially a strong path to unionization. I think, Hal, you're correct in interpreting the Wall Street Journal op-ed as responsive to that criticism of the FTC when they did in fact file the challenge. The president of the CWA in effect said they should not have done so. The reason why I think it's misplaced, that is to say, Lena Khan's op-ed, is because unionization is not akin to other corporate ESG commitment type things. It's not unrelated to competition. That is to say, collective bargaining on the part of workers is a way to deconcentrate power in the economy, which is, after all, the main goal of the FTC and the broader anti-monopoly agenda. So it's not an unrelated thing, and it also has the effect of using a criticism of this merger challenge, you might say, from the left in order to defang a criticism of the current FTC from the right. That is, the setup is like, I have these people on the left asking me to do X, Y, and Z unrelated to competition in adjudicating these mergers, and I'm not going to do that because my job is to follow the law, and that says that this merger is illegal. So all of that is rather unfortunate, in my opinion. On the other hand, I think that the sort of heightening skepticism of anti-monopoly coming from some of the sort of senior union type people that this has engendered is also misplaced. So in my view, this is kind of a train wreck that is in the process of taking place, whereas each side doesn't need to be at odds with one another, but the rhetoric is sort of heightening to the point that some people who want to derail an anti-monopoly agenda from going forward are using this as an excuse to do that, to say somehow that anti-monopolism is contrary to workers' interests, contrary to workers achieving a measure of power in the global economy.
Great. Let's get Sanjukta in here, our special guest. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on the intersection here of monopoly and labor issues. Why don't you take a whack at this?
Yeah, thanks. So, Marshall, I think nicely laid out a lot of the issues here, and I just want to pick up on some of what he said. So, and I think it'll circle back to some of the questions that actually go to just merger policy in general. So I, totally agree, first of all, that we should not think of unionization as an unrelated social benefit, and we shouldn't assimilate it to ESG in general, which for two reasons. One is that ESG potentially covers all kinds of non-binding, things that corporations say they're going to do, but there's no. I mean, that's different from an actual card check agreement. Secondly, the substance of that goes to governance. And one thing that I think we're fundamentally looking at in antitrust, but also in corporate law and labor law, is governance decisions, market governance and corporate governance, and how are governance rights going to be distributed. It's not the only thing, but I would not contrast competition harms to governance. And this is obviously about enterprise governance and then more broadly about market governance. So I agree with that point that Marshall made. However, I think that we should take a step back from this situation, and and I think that the larger stakes are what Marshall articulated, that we are setting up this opposition that does not need to be an opposition, and that I think is being guided potentially by much broader or more general premises than are required. However, you come out on this specific Microsoft Activision issue, where we have a comparison of 2 second bests, and I'll explain what those are. And you can, I think reasonable people can resolve the comparison of these 2 second bests in different ways, right? What is more important to me is that we recognize how these are second bests and what the first best would be, and not embrace these overbroad premises that there needs to be this opposition between a pro-worker labor policy and a robust antitrust policy. Okay, and so what do I mean by that? So specifically, I think it's important to recognize that here, what CWA is, I think, hoping for in an outcome is a second best situation, in that we are, we're getting this card check agreement in exchange for cementing the power of an already quite powerful corporation in various ways, right? Beyond the specific theory of harm that Ted spoke to, right? And that this shouldn't. Okay, so we'll come back to why that shouldn't be, sort of our primary sort of solution to broken labor law. We're comparing that to what is also a second best, which is that the status quo involves broken labor law, right? Marshall spoke a little bit to what a card check agreement addresses. What it fundamentally addresses is that labor law right now doesn't work to effectuate the voices of workers in whether they want to, what are they voting on? Whether they get to have a voice at all, right? Like, it's a weird type of vote, right? And the Wagner Act, as it has, not the Wagner Act essentially so much, but the Wagner Act as it works in practice right now, which is worth giving a moment to this, I think, is the penalties that employers face for violating the NLRA are so minimal. It's just cost of doing business. So they'd rather do that. It's totally worth it to them if they have a fundamental anti-union stance. It's worth it to them to incur Section 7 penalties, which is what these are. Under the NLRA, to avoid unionization. So the card check comes in as, an outside sort of solution to the system that people in the labor world agree is broken. And I think it's sort of important to recognize, so that's a far second best, right? Status quo labor law. And now we're comparing it to this other second best. So what I'm interested in is not, however people come out on this, and not having this lead us into this basic opposition between, you know, a robust pro-union stance and a robust, you know, antitrust stance. And I think that I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I don't think I have to say this, because I hear a lot in different discussions that I have in the academic context, but sometimes also in the policy context. I'll hear from how should I characterize this? You know, people who I think we would all see as we're all roughly like on the same side in terms of wanting to see a more equal and just and sustainable society, to see workers have a greater voice, and, you know, just from progressives, let's say, from progressives and left liberals. I think I'll sometimes hear a level of credulousness or credulity, whatever is the appropriate word, about big firms as an engine of sort of some combination of like efficiency and an ability to like deliver gains to workers that I think we should absolutely question. I don't know where this comes from. You know, I mean, we don't have a basic empirical investigation. There is empirical investigation that goes on, sure, under the label of merger efficiencies and transaction costs, but I believe that those empirical inquiries are basically structured by certain assumptions, right, that don't get empirically investigated. And what are those assumptions? That like basically firms deliver efficiencies on some level. This goes back to Ronald Coase, and it goes back to, you know, that basic theory of the firm idea. And I believe, people are free to disagree with me, I don't know if anyone here is probably going to do that, but that basic theory of the firm literature that I think forms the basis for the transaction cost empirical inquiry fundamentally assumes the conclusion that firms deliver efficiencies over non-firm based forms of coordination, and then we're going to investigate like sort of at the margins, like does this deliver efficiencies over this or whatever. And some of that empirical research has value, I'm not denying that, but it doesn't investigate that core I think that core assumption. And so I want to just super briefly, I realize I'm talking for a long time. I want to super briefly say that there are alternatives, I think, for setting up coordination mechanisms that could, first of all, we could just strengthen labor law, right? Like we could just like have a labor law that works. That would be great. We also can imagine, I think maybe I'll leave it there, that a strong labor law that actually guarantees workers' voice combined with decentralized markets is our first best solution. That should also be a first best solution from the perspective of labor, because just from a labor power perspective, do you want super powerful firms that are, you know, have endless deep pockets to fight unionization campaigns and have all kinds of political and social power to just, you know, to attack workers and other progressive causes? Or do you want antitrust to help rein in corporate power and then have strong labor law? That's the first best. And I think that, and I didn't really talk about the efficiency part of it too much, and maybe we can leave that, but I believe that, and I think that we hopefully will continue to do work to try to bear this out, that we can deliver a lot of efficiencies through decentralized markets that still have certain coordination mechanisms at the market level that I actually think the FTC can participate in. I actually think this was part of the original idea of the FTC. So in other words, you can have some public oversight that will actually de-emphasize the administrative centrality of the firm. So we just assume like what administrative mechanism besides firms could deliver these certain social benefits? Well, there are other mechanisms. There's nothing magical about firms. It's just a collection of human beings doing stuff, and we can work that out in other ways. And I'll stop talking there.
Okay. No, that was great. Sorry.
I want to add something to what Sanjukta was saying about the sort of attitude among labor liberals toward large firms that I think is manifest in some of the conceptual disagreements that Sanjukta has laid out. That is to say, there is a certain class of people who have spent their careers in the labor movement who would see something like the Microsoft Activision merger plus a neutrality agreement as the best possible case for worker empowerment, that workers at big firms and powerful firms in the tech sector benefit when those firms get more powerful and more profitable. And so the route to spreading collective representation in the economy is through that kind of mechanism where you get neutrality agreements in place at powerful, dominant firms, and then encourage those firms to get as dominant and powerful as possible by acquiring suppliers, as in the case of Microsoft Activision. And I just think that worldview is outdated at this point. That, you know, the idea that there is a large firm pay premium, first of all, is questionable. There's good research showing that it's in decline. You know, that's a broad statement about large firms in the economy and not so much about Microsoft or any other firm that might be unionized or not. But it just seems to me like workers have not done very well in living memory out of that type of restructuring of the economy to benefit the largest and most powerful actors. And so if people who have, you know, nominally represent workers in sort of public debate and to antitrust policy are claiming that that's the political economy that they want, they're, you know, fundamentally missing the story and the current moment in terms of the broad empowerment of workers and their demands for voice.
Can I add one super quick thing? Yeah, super quick.
I do want to get Darren in as soon as we can, because we haven't given Darren a chance yet. But and then we'll go back to Sanjukta. Is that okay? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Darren, why don't you go? If you have feelings, you should weigh in. If not, we'll just pass it right back to Sanjukta.
Well, I just want to point out that if you look at the statement that the Communication Workers of America and Microsoft put forward, where in the third paragraph they say, we aren't asking the FTC to ignore competition concerns. On the contrary, we believe it's important to explore solutions to protect competition and consumers while also promoting the needs of workers, economic growth, and American innovation. And my thought on that is I had no idea that Microsoft embraced a general welfare standard, because that certainly sounds like they are looking to broader social benefits apart from just that first sentence, which talks about consumer harm. So I thought that was kind of amusing, and also perhaps agreeing with the rest of the panelists that it's a very kind of a misreading of how the FTC approaches mergers or perhaps trying to position the FTC in an awkward position where it looks like it's anti-labor while it's considering the anti-competitive concerns.
Sanjukta, back to you.
Yeah, just want to add two quick things that Marshall's last disposition made me think of, and because I forgot to mention the large firm pay premium, because we hear about that a lot in these discussions. And I think in addition to what Marshall said about the empirical evidence on the large firm pay premium, I think it's really important to bear in mind this conceptual point, and I would love to see empirical research that takes it into account. So please, somebody do the empirical research on this. That when we do see studies on the large firm pay premium that show, that purport to show it, I would like to know how much of that is coming from increased bargaining power with either downstream or upstream firms in various, like that large firm is able to basically have superior bargaining power and thus be in an extractive relationship with its suppliers or with its franchisees or whatever, right? Because that is not a pro-worker. I mean, like all that you're doing then, if there's a large firm pay premium, then I think it's important for us to notice that that's just a transfer from some workers to other workers, the workers of the suppliers and others, right? I think that intuitively seems likely to account for a lot of the large firm pay premium to the extent it even exists. But secondly, we should have empirical research substantiating that. Secondly, I think it's important to bear in mind that the sort of labor liberal position that Marshall referred to is responding in part to this fissured workplace issue, right? And we can't now talk about the fissured workplace at length, but I think it's really important to notice who created the fissured workplace and recreated these business structures in the economy starting sort of in the 60s, 70s. Large firms with a lot of power, right? Like that's who came up with this. Came up with this whole idea and rewrote rules and did this. So this is what happens actually when we set up an economy that has that it's not this like. It's very weird to look back and say that we had this golden moment in the 1950s, and if we can just statically look at that and recreate that, that will be a labor utopia. We can just look at history to see what occurred. Okay,
that's great. Now, Ted, I was going to move to our second topic, but if you had anything that you wanted to get off your chest on this point, you should feel free, or we can move. Your call.
Okay, I mean, just very, very briefly, just to bring it back to the Microsoft acquisition, the proposed Microsoft acquisition. I'm very skeptical of the CWA's position on this point, and I'm not sure if they're really if this acquisition goes through, they're really getting anything in the long term. I think a lot of that hinges on what's going to happen in the Glacier Northwest decision in the Supreme Court. So to the extent that labor unions can extract any sort of anything from corporations, or can discipline the behavior of corporations, a lot of that's going to rest on what the Supreme Court says, particularly because the labor union is only going to be as effective as it can pose a credible threat of striking. And right, so we've seen this time and time again in sports, for example, right? But but who's going to strike if there's a chance that the corporation can then sue the workers for actually striking? So then if that's the case, then I'd like to know what the CWA has actually extracted from this decision, right? I mean, this is really the bare minimum to me, is an agreement that Microsoft will not stand in the way of a unionization, recognizing that it's always stood in the way of unionization. There's really no unionized employees in the United States at Microsoft, right? So I think the CWA here is getting essentially the bare minimum. It's not so much the second best, but really the bare minimum. And there's really no certainty that they're really getting anything at all. So to the extent that the CWA opposes the merger, and there's sort of the suggestion that, well, the FTC is sort of sacrificing the interests of labor, I would disagree with. Certainly, I would strongly disagree with that position. And final point, I've always been opposed to these offsetting benefits and harms in the input and output markets. So, in my opinion, I think the FTC is correct on this point.
So I think we should go on to the non-compete rule. I would just say that question, that's very last thing you said, Ted, that deserves a whole other Sling episode unto itself. Is whether a union neutrality agreement, or just say collective bargaining by workers in itself, is like quote unquote offset in another market. I think
sorry, I thought you were talking about something else.
Yeah, that it's not. I would say that it is not equivalent, for example, to say hospitals consolidation to offset health insurers consolidating or something of that nature. But I think that's a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, let's move to our second topic, which is the FTC's proposal to ban non-competes under its rulemaking powers granted in the FTC Act. Now, this measure has been endorsed by a wide swath of voices, including, surprisingly, corporate-friendly neoliberals such as Jason Furman and The Economist magazine. Of course, we can always count on the Wall Street Journal editorial page and other anti-worker elements. I think they said that this represents an air kiss to the labor movement. And of course, the chief economist of the ICLE, International Center for Law and Economics, stands firmly in favor of non-competes and anything else that would hurt workers. But Sanjukta, are we observing a shift of the center, perhaps of the political or economic spectrum, in the role of antitrust and perhaps the role of government generally when it comes to labor issues?
Well, I think this proposed rule is really important. And I think, we're going to talk more about why we should see it as important. But, I think the FTC has made a strong case, the effect on wages, the effect on voice at the workplace. So, if we think of this as strengthening workers' power to exit for various reasons, that obviously increases their power on the job, not just in terms of wages, but I think in terms of speaking up for themselves in all kinds of ways, including maybe organizing their workplace, right? I should note a legal point, which is that in most states, even under the rule of reason, which is what sort of state law, state common law sometimes it's a statute, but basically, generally, state law other than California uses something like what we would call a rule of reason to evaluate non-competes. If you get fired, usually in most states, a non-compete isn't enforceable anyway. But as many, many people have noted, workers don't know all the rules, and you're not going to litigate all of this. You're not going to, against your former employer, you don't have the resources. So I still think that it mitigates the fear of being fired during, a union organizing attempt, and that's an important point. That again is an example of these two things working together. So I think it's a super, super important pro-worker, pro-labor rule. And I guess I want to note, you asked about shifts. I want to take a very long view of the shifts here. So important to note that non-compete agreements are actually at the heart of the restraint of trade doctrine at common law. So if we look before the Sherman Act and we look at common law for the, restraint of trade, first of all, it's one of the first, common law offenses that we know of, but non-compete agreements were at the heart of them. Not what we now call price fixing. It was non-compete agreements. The oldest restraint of trade cases involved non-compete agreements, and then they involved what one might call the marketing offenses, like forestalling, but those are also not about price fixing, which argued in a recent paper, right? But these are at the heart. So I saw some commentary that this is reversing, hundreds and hundreds of years of common law, and I wouldn't agree with that, because this is because here's the truth. It's true that there was no per se rule at common law in general, like 500 years ago. So I think but there wasn't a per se rule against price fixing either. And in fact, price fixing was usually permitted under common law, right? So it's really turning things around to say that this is changing a long historical tradition. On the contrary, I think that non-compete agreements is one of the things the restraint of trade doctrine was most hostile to for hundreds of years. And when it shifted in the late 19th century, as the common law of employment started to consolidate into what we now think of as the common law of employment. You'll hear people like Richard Epstein talking about the common law of employment as if it goes back to the year 1100. Not true. It was consolidated in the late 19th century by judges. There was many other forms of labor before that, and more unfree and more free forms of labor. But this common law of employment idea gets consolidated then, and employee non-competes are effectively a special exception at that point. So I hope everyone's getting what I'm saying here, because I feel like this is important. Like it was an anti-worker exception that is how we end up with the common law rule that now the FTC is modifying, right? Does that make sense? So it's like, yeah, this is now specific to workers, but the original rule was also specific to workers in the first place. And so that's just a little perspective on how I think the center has shifted over time, and that I think there's a massive amount of overclaiming about what the sort of force of legal history, the arc of legal history shows here.
Got it. Well, my next question is for Marshall. And that is, I see the non-compete rule, assuming it survives, as being an enormous victory for worker power. And I wanted to ask you, where are the unions on this issue, and are they missing an opportunity, if they don't respond here, to the opportunity represented by both an activist FTC and by the broad public support for collective action by workers?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that if you ask any of the unions, they will say that they support the proposed rule. But I also think that they care more about the neutrality agreement in the FTC in the Microsoft Activision merger and that sort of fight than they do about the non-compete rule. And I think that is unfortunate, because the non-compete rule represents the FTC enforcing and using its full authority on behalf of workers. And there's other ways they could do that. I mean, the non-compete rule is great, but I think Sanjukta or I could write down like 10 other points of enforcement that the FTC could undertake that would involve improving workers' bargaining position in the economy and democratizing power in the workplace. And instead, what we have is unions asking the FTC, in effect, not to enforce antitrust law in such a way that they feel would empower workers. And I think that's a poor advocacy position, let's say, toward a federal agency that is primed to act on workers' behalf. It would be radically missing an opportunity, not just in terms of who's currently in control of the FTC, but also in terms of the broader public upsurge of support for unionization and for voice on the job. You know, if you're a longstanding union, seeing that on the one hand, and officials that are, finally at long last have their ear open to you. On the other hand, you should be coming up with a pro-enforcement agenda to bring to the FTC in order to cement that moment into longstanding power and policy achievement. And I just don't see that has actually happened on the part of at least incumbent unions.
Well, great. Does anyone want to weigh in on things that Marshall was saying to just said before I move on, or are we at a happy place? Oh, Marshall just raised. Do you want to say something else, Marshall?
Well, I want to say more about the non-compete rule that we haven't talked about, if that's appropriate at this time. So
I think he's going to ask other questions about the non-compete rule, right?
I got that we were moving on to the next topic. Is that are you?
No, the next question.
Okay, sorry. Then yes, please continue.
I just wanted to give Ted and Darren a chance. They thought saying was complete bunk, they could push back, but it seems like I'm going to interpret their silence as a complete
consent. Yes.
So I want to say, some of us spend some time on Twitter. It's like a weakness. But I was looking at yesterday's back and forth between Evan Starr and Herb Hovenkamp, and it just struck me, why are some legacy law professors who've leaned on economics as the reason antitrust needs to be so toothless and feckless are now suddenly so unwilling to look at the economic evidence when it doesn't go their way in a policy debate? Does anyone have any feelings about this, or feel free? Or are we going to? I know that Darren wants to go bad onto what Herb Hovenkamp has said on Twitter, right? He said,
let me just preface this that I do love Herb, but I think that one of the problems that law professors have with data, if they have not been trained to use it, is that their priors lock them in to particular sets of data. And then they say, see, this one thing shows that I'm right, as opposed to looking at the empirical literature as a whole. And so I think you get locked into that. And it's very strange because when you hear the law professors argue about precedent, it's really amazing to see that they do the same thing with precedent. They'll lock into precedent that argues their position, no matter how ancient. And then when it doesn't, when it sides against them, they say, well, that's old, right? Philadelphia National Bank is old. Right? All these cases are old. And so the new court wouldn't think that way, even though they've never held that way. So it's a very consistent inconsistency in the way they approach things.
Yeah, you say that's true of law professors, but I think it's probably true of most economists as well, even those who are steeped in data analysis. Right?
I am shocked that you would even think that. And I certainly would never, ever comment on that.
I want to say that while I would normally totally approve of Hal casting aspersions on the economics profession, I don't think it's appropriate in this specific instance, because there's been a notable, I would say, unanimity of support among economists for the FTC's non-compete rule, including Jason Furman, as you previously mentioned, who's been sort of swinging back and forth for a couple of years now on whether workers should or should not have power. He came out in favor of this despite having cast aspersions on the current FTC in a number of other contexts in ways that I thought were less than professional. But the legacy law professors have been, very clear in saying, we don't like this. And they're used to ground, as you opened this question by saying, how they used to ground that stance on their part very much by referring to the economics. And then now that the economists are saying something that they don't want to hear, suddenly economics doesn't matter. Or as you're alluding to, they have these sort of curated, stylized facts about how non-competes are supposed to work that they rely on in the absence of evidence that those little toy models actually matter at all in the real world. So I think that is going to be a very interesting aspect of the fight over the non-compete rule going forward for the next years, as the FTC adopts it, and both their rulemaking authority and the non-compete rule in particular are litigated in federal court. There's going to be a lot of law professors who rely on those little toy models, and economists who have to point to very robust research findings in support of the FTC's position. And the federal judiciary is going to be put in the position of choosing between them. And it's going to create a divide between what actual economists, at least ones who conduct empirical research, have to say, and what law professors say is what economics says. And in the past, the federal judiciary has been very attentive to what law professors say economics says, at least as long as those law professors go in a certain direction. So now that we have actual economists saying that the law professors are wrong about what economics says, it's going to set up a uncomfortable dichotomy for a lot of the people, both on the other side as well as in the judiciary, who will be confronted with a disposition of the expert opinion that isn't what they're used to, I would say.
Now, I was going to move on to the legality of the FTC's proposed rulemaking, which is going to implicate Darren and Sanjukta. But before I do that, Ted, is there anything that you want to hit with respect to the economics? For example, I saw one defense of non-competes on Twitter the other day suggesting, and I won't attribute it, but suggesting that this could actually be a good thing for workers because you could bargain over this dimension, and by accepting it, you could perhaps extract a higher wage as a result. I won't try not to be a leading question, but what did you make of that economic theory? Is it sensible at all?
Let me back up for just a quick second. So just to sort of simplify the point here, I think what employers really want are essentially two things, particularly larger employers. They want at-will employment, and they want non-compete clauses, right? So they want the ability to fire an employee whenever they want, but when the employer wants to make a decision, they want to foreclose that employee from having the freedom to do it, right? So that they want a very one-sided agreement, right? And all the removal of this non-compete clause does is sort of level the playing field, actually quite a bit. And so we can look back historically and see what impacts essentially these non-compete clauses have had in one area where we can look back, and we have a lot of historical evidence here, is in sports, right? So we have essentially the reserve clause that reached back in baseball since the 1880s and so on, and athletes in all the major leagues in the United States labored under this reserve clause, whether it's baseball, football, and so on. And so we can see sort of what happened to the sport, to each of these sports when these clauses were removed, right? When you have the Kirk Flood Act and so on, when you have this sort of this unshackling of the athlete labor, right? And if anything, I think one of the big arguments, so one of the refrains that you hear from corporations is that, well, we're afraid that workers will essentially, that they will invest in the workers and that they'll abscond to some other entity and some other entity will benefit. Well, where that exact thing, if there's any employer that should be worried about that, it might be a sports team, right? It might be a team that essentially invests a lot of effort into, let's say, a superstar, and yet that superstar can leave the following year and so on. And yet we see that we don't have a compete agreement right here. We have contractual agreements, yes, but we don't have this non-compete agreement that, well, if you leave, you can't compete with us. Of course, you're going to compete, and yet, in the absence of those non-compete clauses, what have we seen? Right, we've seen all of the leagues they're all very, very successful. NBA, NFL. Right. So what is this? So this argument that somehow, employees are going to suffer is that, frankly, it's just pure sophistry.
Well, their suffering, Ted, is that they're going to capture a smaller share of the total pie, right? The labor share is going to rise as it did after free agency was acquired.
Yeah, but what you have is a bigger pie. I mean, look at the
That's
pie
right.
that you. I mean, look at the pie that was in the NBA and the NFL, 20, 30 years ago, and look at it now. So,
That's right.
so I think there's a lot of myopia here.
Yeah, one point I would make, I mean, these are excellent points from Ted about the experience of non-compete, eliminating non-competes in sports. I think we have tons of, larger evidence that employers don't really care about the size of the pie when it comes to fighting over the slices of the pie with workers. That is to say, they will sacrifice pie growth in exchange for having the upper hand in bargaining and negotiations. And so all of the evidence that you're citing that says that actually more competition benefits everyone, just doesn't carry any weight at all with employers, even though they will constantly advocate against labor standards on the grounds that labor standards reduce the size of the total pie and thus somehow harm workers.
Darren, go for it.
I think you all are talking about pie. I think the employers are saying let them eat cake, and what I'm thinking here is, and Mark Glick and I are going to have a piece in the Sling about both the benefits and also the procedural discussions in the non-compete rulemaking. But there's no benefit. There's literally no benefit apart from exercising power over workers, absent trade secret in non-competes. None.
Which sorry, I was just going to say, which there is another area of law to deal with and protect.
Yes, exactly right. And so if that's the case, and perhaps it deals with it better, right? Perhaps trade secret law deals with it better, as a less restrictive alternative with more provisions for enforcement. And so absent that, when it always gets commingled, but absent that, then there's no benefit to a non-compete agreement absent some anti-competitive effect.
I just want to add that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just really briefly, I agree with Marshall entirely with that last point, and I think a prime example of that is the NCAA, which is a very sclerotic agency, right? It's deathly afraid of potentially broadening the pie if that means that it has to cede any control over the labor. So that's all I have.
All right, so we've been talking about, I think, the economics. Let's move to where I think the challenge will be, which is a legal one. And it seems like that's going to be the course of action, not so much fighting this policy on the merits. But I'll just, as an example, I was struck by this Sean Heather. He's the antitrust head of the Chamber of Commerce. He issued this interesting press release saying, quote, "We have been preparing for this moment. It has nothing to do with the subject matter, but we don't think they have the authorities." So I'm going to set a little background here, and then I'd like Darren and Sanjukta as our legal experts to kind of help us think through this. But we know that the DC Circuit in 1973 and National Petroleum Refiners said that the FTC could impose such rules. But then the Magnuson-Moss Act was passed, and the FTC never really issued a competition rule since then. Of course, we have the silly Supreme Court stuff about how if it is an important issue, Congress has to be explicit in giving out its authority. So let's have Darren, I think, weigh in first. On what basis does the FTC have the authority to promulgate such a rule to ban non-competes? Could the rule be considered a consumer protection issue by chance? And finally, what is the argument that they lack such authority? And then we'll go to Sanjukta.
So, first of all, if you enter a consumer protection rulemaking and undertake that through the Magnuson-Moss Act, it will take you billions and billions of years to get it through. So there's no benefit to going that route. So the FTC relies on the plain language of its act, which has, there's some disagreement as to what that plain language says as to whether or not it can promulgate rulemaking under this act, under 5G. If you believe, and that's a long, complicated argument that we do not have time for, but if they do have authority under the act, the question then becomes, what are these old cases that are prior to Chevron saying about that ability? And if you believe Chevron is still good law, and if those pieces of those decisions do not, agree that there's ambiguity, then the FTC ought to have some deference if its interpretation is reasonable. That's if you believe that Chevron is good law. There's also a pushback that these things are so idiosyncratic that they should be done through adjudication, not rulemaking. And there's this case law called Chenery 2 that says something like, the choice between rulemaking and adjudication lies primarily within the informed discretion of the agency. And if you believe that's good law, then the agency is perfectly fine engaging in rulemaking. Now, if we go from there to the scariness issues, which the Chamber of Commerce is going towards here, there are two. The major questions doctrine, which basically says, if it's important enough and it's ambiguous, it's not clear enough, the Supreme Court gets to do what they want. It is a rampant judicial activism provision, although conservatives never state it that way. And that just means we trump. And so we'll get to decide, because this is too big for you and Congress wasn't clear enough. The other one is the bigger, scarier issue, which is non-delegation, which everyone thought was dead in the 90s. But the question is, can we even give authority to independent agencies? Because they are not mentioned in the Constitution. And so there's this big threat that we could actually undo the administrative state. Both of those arguments transcend the FTC. This could happen at any time under any agency, under any action. So if you take those criticisms seriously, what you're saying is no one should ever do anything if you're an administrative agency, because scary, right? And that's not a good position going forward, that we should have to be in that position. And it assumes that FTC loses under major questions doctrine and under any sort of non-delegation issue, and that the Supreme Court ignores the remainder of its precedent, which might be a good argument. It's a pretty activist court.
Sanjukta, it's your turn.
Yeah, so that's great. I think just want to re-highlight that point because I think that the discussion is to some extent melding together the statutory authority issue with the constitutional issues, and it's important to see just how overbroad the constitutional issues questions are here. But I want to pick up on that very helpful sort of exegesis of the statute and different statutes and the judicial decisions intervening, some specific to the FTC and some just generally about antitrust law. And I want to say that what I think another set of factors that I think strongly militates in favor of interpreting that trajectory in favor of the FTC's authority is going back and looking at sort of what the architecture of the FTC Act overall was, and what the architect of the agency thought the agency should be doing. And I thought that we saw echoes of this actually in the proposed rulemaking document, the way that they presented what they emphasized again and again, that we're making rules of fair competition. So I want to super briefly sketch that. I mean, so the way I read those key architects like Brandeis, for example, is that what they saw the agency as doing is not just promoting competition. Yes, with non-competes, clearly we are just increasing healthy competition in the labor market, but also channeling competition in particular directions. So I think that Brandeis understood that all markets have competition and coordination in them, and that law and policy makes decisions about how to channel that coordination into particular mechanisms and how to channel competition into particular mechanisms. We can also look at merger policy that way, right? Like that, I think that some colleagues like Sandeep Bahisan and others have made this point about merger policy, that this merger policy, it's not just a permissive merger policy channels competition between businesses into totally unproductive acquisitions and arbitrage, right, at that level that just enriches corporate lawyers and bankers and some shareholders, well, lots of shareholders, and doesn't really result in productive investment. Similarly, we can view the rule that the FTC is hopefully going to be able to successfully promulgate here as channeling, because what is non-compete agreements, in addition to decreasing competition in the labor market, they also are a competitive tactic, which is a point that the FTC makes in those documents. They're a competitive tactic for certain firms to keep out entrants, to gain a competitive advantage over other firms. It is a competitive tactic, and the FTC's rule would not a pro-social competitive tactic, but it is. So this is channeling that competition away, away from this sort of like antisocial and economically non-beneficial form of competition toward, you have to now compete with other firms in other ways, right? So all that sounds like an argument on the merits, but I think it goes to the legal authority, because I think that this is how the agency was fundamentally understood by its architects, that this is what it's going to do. It's going to make decisions about fair competition, and it's going to channel competition in those directions. How is it supposed to do that if we can't make rules about fair competition, right? I mean, I think it's just really core if you look at just all of the discussion and the documents, leading up to the FTC Act, that this is what was envisioned.
Excellent. Well, if it's okay, I'd like to move to our third and final topic of the day, which is Elon Musk, and in particular, Elon's attempt to destroy value for both Twitter and Tesla by cozying up to far-right influencers on the Twitterverse, or as what the Economist dubbed his, quote, libertarian antics. Now, many Musk defenders and other corporate lickspittles like to point to confounding factors that were also affecting, or could have been affecting, Tesla's stock price over the last quarter, such as heightened competition among electric vehicle manufacturers. I have a hard time with this because I can't imagine that any new information came about their heightened ability to compete over the last quarter. But Ted, let me put this one to you. What do we make of the recent and rather surprising news of Tesla's stock drops? And is there any nexus between Musk's libertarian antics on Twitter and Tesla's stock price?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there was concern at the very beginning when Musk first signaled his intent to take a greater share in Twitter, which was in January. He began purchasing shares of Twitter, I think, in January of 2022, and then expanded that to his intent to purchase it in April. But I think it's sort of important to just back up a little bit in time. So what we saw is, so let's go back to the start of the pandemic, where we saw right about, and I think it was February and March. In about February, Tesla stock was about $60. It, of course, dropped in March. I think it was around 28, 29, and so on. And from then, it experienced sort of this, well, not sort of, but actual meteoric rise, right? It rose from about 28 to its zenith at about $400 in, I think it was November of 2021, and then started the drop from there. So even at the time, so let's say in January, I believe Tesla stock was still somewhere around $390. From that point on to now, right now it's about at 120. So it's experienced, I mean, it's lost over 2/3 of its value in terms of over that period. Now that aligns quite well temporally with Musk's interest and his control of Twitter. So is there some nexus there? Are there some other confounding factors? I mean, there is increased competition. I think that's absolutely. I think we know there's been entry from Kia, from Hyundai, from all sorts of other Rivian sort of at the margins a little bit, but the reality is that Tesla still dominates the market. They have over 60% market share. They also, importantly too, they have a higher gross margin than any of these other companies, right? So Tesla's operating. So let's look back again at the start of the pandemic, right? About I don't know if I said 2018, I accidentally wrote 2020. So they were at about 18% margins. They're now at about 26% margins. So of the largest manufacturers, it goes Tesla, Honda, Toyota, Ford, and GM, right? So they have more than double the margins, let's say, of GM, right? So Tesla is still doing well in terms of profitability, but certainly it's the fact that that Musk has sort of eroded his sort of the sort of Tony Stark veneer that I think contributed to the rise of Tesla through his antics on Twitter, has played a large role in the decline of Tesla. I know he wants to attribute it to say, well, no, it's general economic factors. General economic factors are not affecting everyone, right? It's Tesla who's dropping in value. Granted, there's some other issues, some quality control problems. Rolling out the Cybertruck and breaking the windows wasn't exactly confidence inspiring either. So there are hiccups. That's not to say it's a bad car or anything of that nature, but I think there's some instability on Musk's part. That's sort of this. It's sort of peeled back, somewhat cult of personality. That formed sort of the aura around Tesla.
I wanted to go to Sanjukta next, unless Marshall really wanted to weigh in on this causal nexus. No, that's what I figured. But Sanjukta, how did a corporate law dynamics, and we're going to finish with Darren with a question for Darren. How did corporate law dynamics help bring about what I'll call the affair Elon in the first place, and what can we do to change that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's like pieces of this Twitter drama that are about Elon Musk being who he is, and then parts of it that are about sort of the structural system that we've set up in place to decide corporate governance issues. And I think that we see both of them in play here clearly. And I think it's not to the same extreme, but one thing that the lead up to all of this and to the takeover, the sale reminded me of is this the Craigslist case, which many of us teach when we teach corporations, which was a situation in which Jim and Craig actually had this like quite lightly monetized platform, right? Was the platform. Two sides. They had this investor, eBay basically, or the controlling shareholder in eBay, that wanted to grow the platform, to increase the monetization on the platform, and just run it more according to what we think of as the quote shareholder primacy norm, which I think can sometimes be overstated, but run it more according to what that would dictate. And it's a crazy case, and it harkens back to a case actually involving Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers, when they were trying to start their own business, which has it's not an antitrust case, but has obviously implications for competition. Anyway, but it harkens back to that because it's considered one of our, along with the Ford and Dodge case, it's considered one, like a strong articulation of the shareholder primacy norm. And in the Craigslist case, so essentially, Jim and Craig were trying to, it's complicated and unnecessarily, we don't need to go into the details of the jousting that was going on between the eBay investor and Jim and Craig, but basically they were trying to maintain control because they wanted to maintain this corporate culture, this business culture of, which is kind of being, that they're like these early internet hippie types who did really well, but weren't interested in absolutely maximizing the monetization potential here. And they actually lost the specific case. The court said that as long as you were running a for-profit business, you cannot use that, this kind of description of company culture to sort of cabin the shareholder rights of someone who wants to do the opposite, who wants to maximize the monetization possibilities here. So I'm simplifying the facts of that case a little bit, but Twitter, I think in many ways, it's not the same thing. It wasn't, it ended up being a quote friendly deal, but it's not the same thing in any way. But similar themes and dynamic in terms of what we, I think, all liked about Twitter and are sad about what seems to be going away, right, is that it wasn't quite Craigslist, but they were definitely, the old regime was not maximizing all of the, sort of all of the quote, what analysts would refer to as the unrealized potential that was on the table that made it like, a target, a sort of a potential target in the first place, but which we now see what pursuing that often means destroying everything that was valuable about it, right? I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but that is kind of like what's been happening, right? In addition to just Elon's being all over the place and being who he is and having, particular views that he has, that is a dynamic here. And I do think that influenced his, what the board decided to do, because while I think that there are arguments even under existing corporate law that might have allowed them to resist his offer, and then they obviously went to court to enforce it, right? But all of that on some was being driven by their interpretation of what the duties they thought they had to their shareholders. And it is also true that they would have probably gotten a shareholder suit if they hadn't done that, right? Because you'll get shareholder suits either way and on a lot of these things. But what that interpretation of corporate law is that we have to maximize value to shareholders, right? And a lot of the other stuff we've been talking about today more under antitrust, but it implicates the same set of questions. What does the business enterprise and markets exist to do? Does it just exist to maximize value to shareholders, or does it exist to do other things like, provide products that are actually valuable to society? Obviously, to have a governance structure that includes workers and includes others. I mean, these are the questions that we've been talking about. And I think importantly, corporate law intersects and also has things to say about this. And I think that antitrust and corporate law end up working together for bad or ill in this way. So I think that so there's lots of things we could do to change this and make it more, in this particular case, just enabling, I have to believe that if the Twitter board had a clear safe harbor here where they wouldn't have risked that type of, what they believed would be a risky suit from shareholders, that they would have actually not, that they wouldn't have accepted this offer and they wouldn't have gone to court to enforce it. So there's more to be said, but yeah.
Very nice. Well, speaking of shareholder lawsuits, I wanted to bring Darren in. And Darren, if you wanted to respond to something that Sanjukta just said, you should feel free, but let me get the question out. And then it's just, you can go wherever you'd like. But I want to know if there's a viable shareholder lawsuit by Tesla shareholders against Elon for taking actions as a corporate executive in a way that was irresponsible and could be connected, directly to shareholder loss in value by, I want to be specific here, basically blunting the demand among liberal and progressive potential buyers of the Tesla product.
Yeah, good luck with that. But
right, this is your last time on the show for that. But go ahead.
There are shareholder lawsuits against Elon. They paid him a great deal of money to focus on Tesla, and he is not, right? And I think it was Ben and Jerry's who said that a cult of personality can rise and fall. When you have your entire company built around a single person, and Musk has had tremendous TV time, tremendous rise in personality and innovation, and you combine that with him doing what he is doing on Twitter, and also pictures of Teslas not moving or catching fire. And you combine that with promises of self-driving cars that do not come to fruition. I think that latter portion is going to be the biggest potential for suit, if it in fact it is already. So when you what do we used to call it in Microsoft, vaporware? When you create, you say you're going to create a product and it doesn't come to fruition. And so I think those when you have Musk saying these things on Twitter and seeming like for lack of a better term, erratic, it undermines the belief that those things that he has promised will come to fruition, even as they fail to come to fruition. And I think that's what's really driving the loss. And yeah, you'll see some suits, some successful, some not. But the biggest drivers are the shareholders of Tesla saying, we paid you to focus on Tesla. What the heck? Right. And the drivers who go, I paid for these extra things of driverless cars. What the heck? Right. Or my car is catching fire. Those kinds of suits will tend to be more successful.
Okay. Marshall, did you want to have the last word? I should note that I'm going to get kicked out of my hotel room in about 10 minutes. So
I have to make a plug for Mastodon, but I have to end with that. But you can go, Marshall.
Well, I was going to say, so a couple of weeks ago when Musk banned links to Mastodon and other social networks on Twitter, there was a whole question of whether that could count as anti-competitive behavior, and we could have a discussion about
and a blog by Ted Tatos. And a blog by Ted Tatos on that.
Yes, that's right, on the Sling. What I was just on this question of sort of Elon's behavior eroding the franchise value of both Tesla and Twitter, apparently, that people thought they were buying something at a premium that turns out not to be worth as much as they thought it was, because Elon is not as good of a CEO as everyone thought he was, and all of this mystique that built up around him. Just this week, I saw that he throttled Ken Klippenstein for posting video of a Tesla stalling on the Bay Bridge and causing an 8-car pileup. So that, to me, then again raises these questions of anti-competitive conduct. Now, if we're going to discuss that under the heading of antitrust, then we have the question of whether Tesla is dominant or something like that, or whether it causes harm to competition, whereas it just seems like, shady conduct as CEO of one company in order to protect the value or his position vis-a-vis another company that the same person happens to own. The problem there is excessively powerful shareholders and insufficient regulation of media content. That is to say, it should be against the rules for the owner of a media company to throttle information that is of public value if it is privately harmful to his other interests. That gets to the deregulation of media across the board. That again is responsible for both rampant misinformation and media consolidation.
All right, Sanjukta wants to give a plug to Mastodon for us to finish this off.
And specifically, I think it's an anti-monopoly plug for Mastodon, because Mastodon, while it has its limitations, partly because all of you are not using it as your primary social media site, so we have some control over this and an obligation, which is why I'm making this pitch. But notice the whole structure of Mastodon, what it is. It's what some of us think we could have instead of the system we have now, right? Which is it's decentralized coordination. It's it is potentially an anti-monopoly experiment, right? Like these independent servers engaging in loose horizontal coordination with one another, gaining therefore like the benefits of these network effects and all of these things without having one huge top-down run company, which then is also vulnerable to being taken over at the top by an Elon Musk type. So I think that whether this experiment succeeds or not, this is the type of experiment that we should be trying to aim to create in different sectors. And we should all support Mastodon, and we should be on Mastodon and encouraging growth.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're going to have to end it on that. I really appreciate you guys so much for taking time off on a Sunday morning to join the Slingshot. And I look forward to extending this conversation in other forums. So have a great one. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Good talking with all of you. Bye.
See you guys.